Hello, my friend. Welcome. I am so glad you're here. I've been dreaming about launching this podcast for years now, and here we are, episode one. I am delighted you're joining me. For today's episode, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what to expect on the podcast, who it's for, who it's not for, what you might hear on the podcast, what you won't hear on the podcast. I'll give you a sneak peek into season one, which is going to be amazing. And I also wanted to share a little bit about my personal and professional journey to give you a sense for where I'm coming from, why I started the podcast, what some of my core values and beliefs are. And I'm also going to share some of the key foundational messages that I want to invite you to hold in your heart, in your mind, as you listen to the podcast and as you navigate your journey as a parent. So settle in, grab a lovely cup of whatever you prefer. Fun fact, I am drinking hot water. Yes, that is tea without the tea. I often drink lemon ginger, but I'm out, so hot water it is. And let's dive in. Welcome to Single Parenting with Connection, Not Perfection, the podcast that honors your messy reality. It's the support you crave without the usual emotional landmines. I'm your host, Dr. Gila, and I promise I will never tell you to just tag your partner in. Before we start, quick reminder. While I am a licensed psychologist and a certified coach, this podcast is not coaching and it's not therapy, and it's not a replacement for medical or psychological advice. It is for educational and informational purposes only. All right, let's dive in. So let's start with who the podcast is for. Now, obviously, the short answer to that is it's intended mostly for single parents, but I want to highlight a few things about that. First of all, I want to just name that single parents are not a monolith. They are not a homogeneous group. There are a lot of paths to single parenting, and even within the different paths, there are different experiences. So I have met some beautifully supported and resourced parents who are single parents, and I've met partnered parents who feel utterly and completely alone. And so I like to just name that because, of course, we often end up talking about generalizations. And I just want to say, I realize often these are generalizations. And I am going to do my best to not just rely on generalizations, but to also try to feature guests and topics and really address some of the unique challenges and blessings of the different sort of flavors of single parenting, whether that's widowed or separated or divorced, single mom by choice, single dad by choice, or something in between. And I also want to say that if you are not technically a single parent, but you either feel like you're often on your own, which I can very much relate to, or even if you have a partner and some of the topics that we cover on the podcast really appeal to you and resonate with you, by all means, you are most welcome here. And please, if you get something out of the podcast, that makes my day. So we are going to cover a lot of topics that apply across the board, no matter what your parenting situation. So things like emotion regulation and tantrums and meltdowns and power struggles and self-care. And, I'm hoping down the road to get into things like financial literacy and cooking skills with kids and all kinds of topics. I have big plans, folks. So I think a lot of the content will apply even if you're not a single parent. But what I want to say is that this is a space where I am not going to assume that you have a partner. And in fact, I'm going to mostly assume that you don't have a partner. So you're never going to hear me say, you should just tag your partner in when you're feeling at your wit's end, right? In fact, you're never going to hear me say you should just do anything. Just is one of my least favorite words, unless you're talking about like a just society, justice, and that kind of thing. I find just is a four-letter word that often really minimizes things that are complex, nuanced experiences. And that is certainly the case for parenthood. So it's not about just doing X or just doing Y as if it's easy peasy and then life will be unicorns and rainbows. So I'm going to do my best to avoid that word. And I'm certainly not going to tell you to just tag your partner in. You're also not going to hear me say that single parent homes are broken homes. That is a pet peeve of mine. I will not be saying that, and I will not have that on the podcast. You're also not going to hear a lot of fear-based parenting. That is not my personal parenting approach or philosophy. I'll get into that a little bit more in this episode. And another thing that I really want to highlight is that I am going to do my darndest to make sure that you don't hear anything that is bigoted or intolerant in any way. There is no room for hate on my podcast. And again, I recognize we are all perfectly imperfect and we are all on a growth and learning journey when it comes to all of this. So I can't promise perfection, but I can promise I am going to do my best because there is so much distrust and invalidation and dismissal and hatred of an intolerance of people who are different than ourselves in the world. And it pains me. And I am determined to keep this podcast a space where that is not the case. So, those are some things that you will not hear. What you will hear on the podcast are some specific challenges and blessings that are often the case for single parents, practical tools and strategies that you can use to support yourself and your child, a whole ton of compassion and validation and empathy, a lot of trust me, I get it because I do. I mean, I might not get everything, right? Let's be honest. But what I want you to hear and to really take home from this is that you are not alone on this journey and in these experiences, and that it makes sense if you are struggling in some of these things. So we're going to talk about some of those struggles and some practical strategies and tools. I do want to highlight some of the blessings also. It is not all doom and gloom. And I also, like I said, I'm going to talk about more general parenting topics that you might get on a podcast that isn't just for single parents, but I will always bring my single parent lens. And I also want to add, most of my clients tend to have kids who are beautifully complex. I always struggle with what words to use to describe it. Some might say strong-willed or spirited. Often they're neurodivergent. And so that is an area of particular passion and expertise of mine. And I feel particularly passionate about putting out resources that are useful for families who have kids who maybe don't fit that typical box, that typical mold. And so you'll hear a lot of that on the podcast as well. So I talked a little bit about my values just a minute ago. I want to take a step back and tell you a little bit more about me, who I am, my background, and why I am doing this podcast in the first place. So I go by Dr. Gila in my coaching work. Gila rhymes with tequila. People seem to enjoy that. Yes, it's like the Gila monster, except that's actually pronounced Gila monster, but a lot of people don't know that. I tend to say I started out as a psychologist and a neuropsychologist, but actually, I really started before I became a psychologist and a neuropsychologist. I was a science writer, a medical writer, and editor. And I bring that up because I was thinking recently about how I do think it comes in to play in my work as a coach. And I think on the podcast, it will as well. It's really, this background has been incredibly useful across the board because, first of all, simplifying complex information and coming up with relatable, easy to understand analogies and visuals, that's the stuff that I love to do. And I love when I can see that it helps information finally click and stick with someone. And the other piece is that in my work as a medical writer and editor, I did a lot of interviewing and I love interviewing. I'm a social introvert, as I like to say. I love having in depth conversations with people and being able to ask thoughtful and compassionate questions that might spark meaningful insight and shifts. And so I love doing that in my coaching work and also in my therapy work. And I love doing that when I'm talking with guest experts, which you'll hear on this podcast as well. So after I was a medical writer and editor, I went back to school. I actually already had a master's degree in neuroscience. And then I went back to school and I got my PhD in clinical psychology with a specialty in neuropsychology. And then I did my advanced postdoctoral training in neuropsychology as well. And I was working as a neuropsychologist when COVID hit. So all of that just to say, I went to school for far too long and I'm a total brain nerd. And even with all of that experience and all of that intense training, and I was at programs like Oxford and Hopkins, so it was intense. And even with all of that, nothing has taught me more or stretched me more or inspired me more than becoming a mom. And in my case, specifically, a single mom to an incredibly awesome and beautifully strong willed kiddo. And I know it's really incredibly cliche to say, so pardon the cliche. But I do think that a big thing that drew me to psychology in the first place, other than being a brain nerd, is this sort of deep desire to make the world a better place. I warned you, it was cliche. But to make the world a better place. And through my personal and professional journey, I have become increasingly convinced that really one of the most powerful and effective ways that we can make a meaningful difference in the world is by raising each generation to be compassionate, curious, aware of the people and things around them, emotionally and culturally attuned, and ultimately confident, resilient, and well adjusted. And the best way to do that is by supporting the parents because we parents have our own stuff going on. And if we don't get the support that we need and that we deserve, this parenting gig that is already hard is even harder. And, I know it's cheesy again and cliche, but I did want to highlight that because right now, there is a lot going on in the world that feels really heavy and really intense. This podcast is launching in September 2025, but I am willing to bet that no matter when you're listening to this episode, that's probably still true. There's a lot that's really heavy, really intense, and it can feel really powerless. We can feel really powerless and really hopeless and really helpless. And when I am feeling that way, one thing that I remind myself and always come back to is the deeply important work of parenting. Now, I am not saying that this is the only thing that we can or should do to impact the world in a positive way, but I am saying that I really deeply believe that this work, parenting, showing up for your child, and giving them the tools that they need to move through this world in a compassionate way is one of the main ways that we are going to shift all that heaviness, all that intensity, and to bring about a better world. So that's my zoomed out big picture why. And zooming in a little bit more, I'll share that my own parenting journey has definitely been bumpy. And I took a deep dive to figure out how to best support my kiddo through some pretty tough stuff in a way that he needs and deserves, and also is aligned with my values. And in that process, and I have to say, it's a process that's never over. It is always a work in progress. I have not checked it off the list. I am still working on it and evolving and growing. But in that process, I learned so much that really has significantly shifted and given me powerful tools that do help support him and me in a way that has made a real transformative difference for us. And in that process, I became really passionate about helping other parents on their beautifully unique, bumpy parenting journeys. So that is why I became a certified parenting coach. I'm a JAI certified parenting coach. I am also a therapist. I actually have two separate businesses. I have a virtual therapy practice in New York State where I can do therapy with anyone who lives in New York State. And then my virtual coaching business where I do parent coaching with anyone, anywhere in the world. And while I do have some clients that are married and partnered, I have become increasingly focused and passionate about creating supportive spaces and resources that really center the single parent. And one of the reasons is because, so there was one day towards the beginning of my coaching journey, I was on Instagram. I was still pretty new to social media. I have to tell you, I am not a huge social media person, but I was on Instagram, and for whatever reason, there were three reels that I saw in the span of like 5 minutes that each had something that I thought could feel triggering for single parents, some messaging that could sort of trigger those feelings of guilt and shame and fear and sort of outsideness, right? Being abnormal and on your own that I know a lot of single parents feel. And in that moment, I really started to wonder maybe it would be best for me to really focus on supporting single parents. And even though I was reluctant to do that because I want to be able to help and support anyone who wants help and support, and I'm open to doing that, I do think that there is a need for spaces that really center single parents, where the single parent experience is not the abnormality, but is what we are naming and acknowledging and talking through and focusing on. And the more I do that, the more I focus on creating these spaces for single parents, the more I hear from people how grateful they are for it and how powerful it is to have these spaces where everyone else gets it on some level, right? Of course, we are not all experiencing exactly the same thing, but where everyone else gets it on some level. One of my mottos has become, even if you're on your own, you don't have to do it alone. It is not only okay, but I think healthy and necessary even to get support in one way or another. I'll be the first to tell you, it is still something that I struggle with. It is hard to ask for help. It is hard to accept help. And it is often hard to find help, right? That takes energy and it takes resources and it takes all these things. So I know that. I recognize that. I am not saying it's easy. What I am saying is that you do not have to do this alone. And that is part of why I am launching this podcast, because in my work with single parents and in my like being out in the field, as it were, talking to single parents, I know that there are so many who feel alone, who feel isolated, who feel like no one really gets it, no one really understands. And then especially on top of that, if you have a complex kid, a neurodivergent kid, a strong-willed kid who doesn't just kind of follow along with all the traditional parenting methods that you try, it can feel even harder, even more isolating. And so I wanted to put out this resource that can help give you a starting point. So that's one of my big sort of whys for the podcast. And I wanted to share with you, I've already talked to you a little bit about some of my core values and my core beliefs around parenting. And there's a few that I just want to name more explicitly. One is honesty and authenticity. And I know these words have become really also cliche and overused. I don't know what other words to use, though. That is what I'm trying to describe. They are two of my top values. I have other values as well, but honesty and authenticity. And so my promise to you is that I will do my best to be honest and authentic on this podcast. And it is at the heart of everything that I do, including parenting. Another really core value for me is, well, two, I guess they go hand in hand, are respect and compassion. And this goes for our kids, for other humans, and for ourselves. And I want to talk a little about all three of those. So, in terms of our kids, there's all these different like parenting terms: peaceful parenting, conscious parenting, connected parenting. It's hard to know what terms to use. Ultimately, I think that what most accurately describes my approach to parenting and my philosophy and what I aspire to, I do not always get it perfectly, but what I aspire to is respectful parenting. But I don't use that term because I think respect is one of the most misused and misunderstood words, especially in the world of parenting. It is often used to mean compliance and obedience and deference. Whereas what I mean is when you respect someone and treat them with respect, you treat them as though their experience, their voice, their perspective is worthy and valid. And when we were talking about making the world a better place, imagine if everyone in the world was raised feeling that deep in their bones, that they matter, that their voice matters. Imagine what a different world we would have. Respect and compassion for other humans. This is, of course, a very complicated topic because I'm not saying that you should agree with what everyone does or says. I am not saying you should let people do whatever they want to. I am saying having respect for and compassion for people while also having the respect and compassion for yourself to be able to take care of your boundaries, your needs. So I'm not going to go into all of that right now, but I just want to put out there that this podcast, like I said before, I am going to do my best to foster a culture of compassion through this podcast where, regardless of a person's sexual identification, gender identification, racial background, religious background, ethnic background, national background, ability, status, neurotype, any of that, that everyone is by default viewed with a compassionate and respectful lens. And then the third piece of respect and compassion is having that respect and compassion for yourself, which honestly is sometimes the hardest part. And we'll talk a lot about that on the podcast, I'm sure, because self-care and self-compassion as a parent is not only vital for your own well-being, but also is a gift for your kids. So we'll talk more about that. This is a good place to segue into the next value, which is imperfection, because with all of what I just said, you're not going to do it perfectly. I don't do it perfectly. Nobody does it perfectly. And I like to say, I say it often, perfection in parenting is not the goal, ever. And there's two reasons for that. One, perfection is not realistic, right? Maybe if you're the Dalai Lama, but even then, you are human, you are a parent, you are most likely a single parent. You may be single parenting a kid who has some challenges or some complexities that don't fit into our society in a way that makes life go smoothly, right? You are carrying a lot in a society that isn't built to support that. And so you're going to have moments where you mess up, quote unquote, where you make mistakes, where you snap and you yell, where you respond in ways that you don't like. I certainly do, and every single parent that I know does too. And so the other piece of that, so two reasons, right? One, it's not realistic. The other piece is that we have an opportunity to model for our children. They're watching us, whether whether you like it or not. They're watching what you do. And so there are some things that kind of are hard about that, but there are some things that are really beautiful about that. And this imperfection piece, and I'm talking about imperfection within reason. Of course, I'm not talking about abuse and neglect and things like that. But imperfection within reason is our opportunity to model for our kids that being imperfect is what it means to be human. That when they are imperfect, it is not because they are bad, they are failing, they are broken. It is because they are human. And importantly, it's an opportunity to model for them what you can do in those moments of imperfection. How do you take ownership for those imperfections and work on improving yourself and improving those interactions? Work on the repair and the reconnection. So it can be a beautiful opportunity for modeling. Now, the yang to the yin of perfection is not the goal is that small shifts can make a big difference. And I like to put that after the perfection isn't the goal because I don't want you leaving with the idea that, well, I can't be perfect, so why even try, right? Why work on this at all? But the thing is that even in our imperfections, working on ourselves as humans and as parents, even the small shifts, you can see a really big difference. And so it is worth it. And it's worth it because one of my other mantras, you are your child's greatest asset. You have so much power and influence to help your child. It is, I know, a heavy responsibility. And I'm not going to lie, it is a heavy responsibility. And it is also a beautiful opportunity. And I know that a lot of single parents, or anyone really, who there are things in their life that haven't gone the way that they wanted, or expected, or planned, or hoped and dreamed for, it can feel like you don't have agency, you don't have control, you don't have power in your life. This is a place where you can make a difference. Working on yourself, working on your parenting, working on how to show up for your child the way that they need and the way that they deserve is one of the things that you can do that does make a difference. And then the last one that I just want to highlight, I did reference this a little bit ago, but it's worth repeating. If things feel hard, if you feel like you are struggling, it is not because you are a bad human or a bad parent. It is not because you're failing or broken or inadequate. It is because you are a perfectly imperfect person carrying too much in a world that isn't built to support you in that weight. And I just want you to hear that and to know that you deserve support. You deserve support. Whatever that looks like, you deserve support. All right, so I'm going to get off my values soapbox here and give you a little preview for this season. When I work with clients, I have a framework that I like to use. I call it nurtured roots or routes, Routes. And it is based on the idea that I think all parenting situations, challenges often come down to three core pieces. And what I've noticed is that often parents come in focused on one of these three. And more often than not, maybe even always, it is worthwhile to look at the other two as well. And the three pieces are, and it's going to sound very simple, but there's beauty in its simplicity, I think. The three pieces are you, the parent, your child, and your connection with your child. And I like to think of it like a tree. So you, the parent, are the roots of the tree. And if you think about a tree, if the tree has really firmly grounded roots, then when the storms blow, which they will blow, when the storms blow, the tree stays upright. You, the parent, matter as an individual, as a human, and also in your parent-child relationship. Your part of the process matters. It grounds you and it grounds your relationship with your child. And so, learning how to take care of yourself, be compassionate with yourself, understand your triggers, build tools that help you navigate the world and this parenting journey in a way that is aligned for you, figuring out what that means, what values you do have, and how to align with those values. All of that work, that deeper work, is so important. And I know that sometimes it feels like the real problem is my kid is having a tantrum. And absolutely, that is a piece of it. But often there is also a piece of how you are experiencing that tantrum and what you are bringing to that. And again, you are your child's greatest asset. And the more that we can support you in that process and in the parenting experience, the better you can support your child. The trunk is the child piece. So this is, I find my whole body sort of like I sit more strongly when I even say that, when I envision this strong trunk. And the idea here is that the more we can understand your unique child, both in terms of general developmental principles, brain science, all of that good stuff, and your individual child and their uniqueness, their strengths, their superpowers, their challenges, the more you can show up for them as an individual, right? And this is part of the parenting process, I think, is really getting to know and attuning to the child in front of you. This is the love the one you got, right? Not the one that you envisioned when you were a teenager, but the one actually standing in front of you. And sometimes that takes some breaking down of preconceived ideas and sort of rebuilding some ideas to really acknowledge the child standing in front of you. And then the branches, the big branches, little branches, the leaves, the flowers, the fruit of the tree, these are all about how we connect with our child, how we build relationship with our child. And just like if you envision leaves on a tree, there might be like an individual strategy. Like, let's say your child refuses to brush teeth and you get them to brush teeth by pretending there's a lion in their mouth that doesn't like to be tickled or something like that. That's a leaf on the tree, and that leaf might serve you in one season and then fall away and not serve you in the next. But the general idea, the theme there of play and connection is still going to be true. And then as you grow and as your tree grows, you will build and develop more beautiful branches and leaves and flowers and so on. And I think it's important to keep in mind that trees don't grow in a linear fashion. You don't grow the roots and then grow the trunk and then grow the branches. Everything feeds each other. It's all interconnected. And each of these three pieces really supports the other. And so I really believe that each of these three pieces are worth our time and energy and attention. And what I thought that I would do in season 1 of the podcast is to use that framework as a bit of a sort of guiding framework for the organization of the season. And so I'm going to be sharing a key lesson from each of those three pieces. And I'll be sharing some guest interviews that relate to that topic that I think you're going to love. So some of those topics are going to be, how do you get through burnout, parent burnout? I hear so often, I am burnt out. I can't do any of the parenting, figuring it out and getting better at that because I can barely survive right now, right? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how do you communicate with a difficult ex, because that affects you, the parent, it affects your child, and it affects your relationship with them. How do you deal with things like abandonment trauma, helping your kids when they are feeling abandoned while you are feeling abandoned, right? How do you view and understand children's behaviors like defiance, these tough behaviors for us to deal with? How do you connect with your child through play and through communication? And so much more. And I'm also hoping to get some voices from single parents and or people who were raised by single parents. And I'm going to invite you, if you have a story that you would love to share, or if you know someone who would make a great guest. I do have season 1 all mapped out, but I would love to hear from you if you have ideas for future seasons, future guests, either single parents or expert guests that you would want me to have on the podcast. Please let me know. I will put my email address in the show notes below, but it's hello@drgilaparenting.com. And I'd love to hear from you. If you have questions also just about parenting in general, if you have a topic that you want me to cover, please let me know. And on that note, I'm going to end with another request for you, which is that I would love not only your feedback, I love hearing positive or constructive, your feedback. How can I make this better? What do you love that you want to see more of? And if you would write a review and rate the podcast, that would mean the world to me. It will help the podcast show up and get in the ears and hands of more single parents who deserve some support. So I'd love if you would share the podcast, rate and review it. And again, please, this is your open invitation. Reach out to me anytime if you have questions, comments, concerns, suggestions. I am here to hear. All right. Well, thank you for joining me on this journey, truly, heartfeltly. I am so excited to share more with you in upcoming episodes. The next episode, I am going to be sharing with you my framework for understanding emotion regulation and self-regulation. I know this is a hot topic. I get questions about it all the time. So I thought we would start there. I'm excited to share it with you. Again, please feel free to reach out, and I will see you on the next episode.